The livestock track into Grayville Valley was half mud, half frozen rut, and my wolf had been pulling at my ribs since the first ridge. I had learned in 3 years of riding border roads not to fight him. He was older than my pride and more honest than my advisors. When he pulled, I rode. When he went quiet, I paid attention to what the silence meant. On this particular morning, in the blue hour before full light, with the Ashvarn reaches dropping away behind me and the valley spreading below like something cupped in cold hands, he was not pulling so much as insisting, a low, sustained pressure behind my sternum that had no word in our language. It was the feeling of a door held open. It was the feeling of a name you already know before the introduction is made. I had felt it before. 3 years ago, for the first time, in a ceremony hall on the night of the autumn gathering, when a woman carrying a tray of healer's instruments had walked through the far door, and my entire chest had rearranged itself around a single, wordless recognition. I had said nothing that night. I am a king. I have learned that silence is authority, that waiting is strategy, that a man of my position does not speak until he is certain. What I had not yet learned at 34 was that certainty is not the same as courage, and that the woman on the far side of the hall was watching my silence and reading it as rejection. By morning she was gone. I have had 3 years to consider what I should have said. Her name was Senna. I knew that much from the autumn gatherings register Senna of no pack designation, daughter of the late healer Marin of the lower valley, unlisted under any alpha's territory because the lower valley had not had a territorial alpha in 2 generations. She was not a rejected omega. She was not scorned, not cast out, not overlooked by some cruel ceremony of pack standing. She was simply a woman who belonged to no one's roles, who had come to the autumn gathering as her mother had before her, to trade medicines and offer her healer's skills to those who could not afford the pack healers, and who had walked into the ceremony hall at the wrong moment and altered the entire axis of my life. Or the right moment, I was still deciding which one it was. My wolf had known immediately. That was the part that undid me in the years after, not the recognition itself, which had felt enormous and impossible in the way of all true things, but the certainty with which he had known. No deliberation, no waiting, just that deep, full stillness like a bell struck and then held the vibration of it running through every bone. He had gone completely quiet inside me in a way he had not done in, I could not remember, since my father was alive, perhaps. Since I was young enough to believe that being king was simple. I had stood across the hall from her and felt my wolf settle into a silence that was the opposite of emptiness, and I had said nothing, because I was a fool who had mistaken his own stillness for composure. She had glanced at me once. I could not read at the time what was in that glance. Later, I would go over it 10,000 times on winter roads. What I decided, eventually, was that she had looked at me the way a woman looks at a closed door. She had measured it, made her assessment, and turned away. By the 3rd hour of that night, I had gathered myself enough to cross the hall. The tray she had carried was still on the table near the eastern wall. She was not. I asked the gathering steward. He told me she had left before midnight. He told me the lower valley was a day's ride south, but that the family cottage had been empty for 2 seasons. The mother was gone, and the daughter moved, though he could not say where. I rode south at dawn. I found the empty cottage. I found neighbors who knew Senna as a child but had not seen her in a year. I found a woman in the lower village who said she had heard something about a healer's apprentice position somewhere in the Grayville foothills, but the details were uncertain, and the foothills covered a great deal of ground. I had covered a great deal of ground since then. 3 years, every border road in the Ashvarn reaches, every outlying settlement, every traveling healer's circuit, every market in the upland basin. My wolf never lost the direction. He could not give me a distance, could not give me a name or a settlement or a landmark, but he could give me a bearing, the way a lodestone gives you north. And for 3 years the bearing had been, southeast of here. Further, keep riding. On this particular morning, in the blue hour before full light, the bearing had changed. It was no longer southeast, it was here stop. The Upland Basin Treatment House was not what I expected. I had imagined, in the way you imagine things when you have been looking for something for 3 years, something modest but perhaps still. A small healer's practice, shuttered in the early morning, with a sign and a threshold and a reasonable explanation for why I had ridden through 3 winters to find it. What I found was a building in the middle of organized chaos. There had been a mudslide 2 days prior, from what I gathered. 3 farmsteads had been swept partially into the Valley Creek, and the treatment house had absorbed the injured as fast as the valley could carry them up the track. There were people on pallets in the entrance room. There were 2 older women moving between them with the quiet efficiency of long practice. There was a boy of perhaps 12 running supplies from a storage room to the back corridor as fast as his legs could carry him, and he nearly walked directly into my horse before he noticed me. He looked up. He looked at the Ashburn crest on my cloak. His eyes went somewhat large. "She's in the back," he said without my asking anything. Then he remembered himself. "My lord." "She," I said. "Senna." He said it with the confidence of someone who has no doubt which she you would be asking about. "She hasn't stopped since yesterday morning. She won't come out until they're all stable." He considered this, then added with the frankness of 12-year-olds, "You can wait inside if you want. It's warmer." I dismounted. I tied my horse. I went inside and waited. She came out of the back corridor an hour later, wiping her hands on a cloth, saying something over her shoulder to one of the older women about a compressed schedule and an infusion that needed to be checked before noon. She was talking as she walked, not looking up, and she was nearly through the door into the entrance room before she registered that the entrance room contained, among its other occupants, an Alpha King she had last seen 3 years ago across a ceremony hall. She stopped. She looked at me, the cloth in her hand stilled. I had thought about this moment on approximately every road I had ridden for 3 years. I had composed speeches. I had discarded speeches. I had decided on composure, on explanation, on apology, on simply stating the truth, all of them in rotation, on winter roads when the cold made everything feel clarifying, and none of the words seemed wrong yet. Standing in the entrance room of the Upland Basin Treatment House, with a woman looking at me with an expression I could not fully read, I said none of them. What I said was, "I've been looking for you." A pause. The compressed schedule and the infusion that needed to be checked before noon had apparently not prepared her for this. "I know," she said. "I had not expected that." "I heard," she clarified, which explained nothing and also explained everything, because of course the border settlements talk, and of course an Alpha King riding every road in the reaches for 3 years would eventually be remarked upon. Word travels. She looked at me with those careful healer's eyes that had been measuring things since she walked in. "Why don't you sit down," she said, "and let me finish the morning round, then we can talk." She said it the way she had presumably said 100 things to 100 difficult patients, not unkindly, but without particular room for argument. She was, I understood then, not afraid of me, not even slightly. This was, unreasonably, the most appealing thing I had encountered in 3 years. I sat down. I waited. My wolf, who had been insisting for approximately 40 miles, went quiet in a way that was not stillness so much as sufficiency. The feeling of a door held open, finally, by someone on the other side. I had not intended to stay longer than a day. This is not entirely an excuse. I had a territory to govern, advisors who were managing that territory with variable competence in my absence, and a border to maintain that did not maintain itself. One day to see her, to explain. 2, I had not worked out precisely what came after to explain. I had assumed the explanation would be the hard part. I had not considered that the explanation might go smoothly and still resolve nothing, because the thing that needed resolving was not a misunderstanding so much as a silence that had lasted 3 years, and silences of that duration do not dissolve in a day. She was busy. The mudslide had created more work than the treatment house could comfortably manage, and 2 of her regular helpers had families in the affected farmsteads and were occupied with their own recoveries. She did not ask me to stay and help. She also did not tell me to leave. She simply worked, and I was there, and eventually, on the second morning, when I found the boy trying to carry a water barrel that was clearly too heavy for him, I put down my cloak and carried the barrel. This is how it began. There is a particular humility to making yourself useful in a place that did not ask for you. You cannot do it with pride and tact. You carry the things that need carrying. You hold the things that need holding. You learn, fairly quickly, which tasks are yours to take and which belong to people who know this place better than you do, and you stay out of the way of the latter. I had governed the Ashvaran reaches for 11 years. I had commanded men and managed territory and made decisions that affected thousands of lives, and I had never in that time felt quite as specifically useful as I did on the 3rd morning in Grayville Valley, when I figured out the correct angle to hold a door so that the older healers could move pallets through without jamming the frame. Senna noticed. She did not comment on it. She had, I was learning, an economy of expression that was not coldness. She laughed when something was funny and spoke directly when something needed saying, but she did not use words as decoration. She said what she meant. She did not say things simply to fill air. In this she was entirely unlike every other person in my life, and it was, after 3 years on the road alone, like stepping out of wind. We talked in the evenings. After the last rounds, after the treatment house quieted, after the boy, his name was Fenwick, and he had appointed himself my unofficial guide to the valley with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who has decided you are interesting, went home to his family. We sat at the table near the hearth in the treatment house's small back room, which served as both Senna's workspace, and when she could not leave, her sleeping quarters, and we talked. She told me about the valley. I told her about the reaches. We talked around the thing between us for the first 3 evenings with the mutual, unspoken courtesy of 2 people who understand that a thing of that size requires some approach before it can be named directly. On the 4th evening, she named it directly. "You stood across the hall from me for 3 hours, she said. She was not looking at me when she said it, she was looking at the fire in the way of someone reviewing a memory. You didn't approach. You didn't speak. I looked at you once and you didn't move." She paused. I thought I had misread the situation. I thought I had imagined whatever I felt when I walked into that hall. I thought the polite thing was to leave before either of us had to acknowledge it. "You hadn't misread it," I said. "I know that now." She looked at me then. Her eyes were level, neither accusing nor forgiving, simply open. "What were you waiting for?" I had been asked this question by no one, because no one had known to ask it, and I had asked myself a version of it on approximately every road in the reaches for 3 years. The answer I had arrived at, slowly, over the course of those roads, was not comfortable. "I was waiting to be certain," I said, and I confused certainty with permission. A silence, the fire settled. "Certain of what?" she said. "That what I felt was real." I looked at her. "I have been a king since I was 23. I have learned that a king does not act on impulse. I have learned to wait, to verify, to make sure. I looked at you across that hall and felt something I had no framework for, and my first instinct was to wait until I understood it. And by the time I understood it, I stopped. You were gone." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire made small sounds in the hearth. "I felt it too," she said finally. "I want you to know that I'm not," she considered. "I'm not telling you this to be kind. I'm telling you because it seems relevant and because I've been living with the fact of it for 3 years while not knowing what to do with it, and you've apparently been living with the same thing." She looked back at the fire. "I didn't leave because I didn't feel it. I left because I thought you didn't." "I know," I said. That is, the part I have had 3 years to understand. We sat for a while in the particular quiet of two people who have located the thing that was lost, and are not yet sure what to do with it now that they have. "You can stay," she said eventually. "If you want, there's still work enough." She said it without drama, in the same tone she used to give compressed schedules, simply the facts, simply the offer. And I think there's more we should say, but not tonight. Not tonight, I agreed. My wolf lay down inside me, for the first time in 3 years, with the unhurried ease of an animal who has finally arrived somewhere he intended to go. I sent word to my head advisor on the 5th day. I told him I was in Grayville Valley and that the border circuit was extending. I did not explain further. He would manage. He had been managing with variable competence for 3 years of searching, and he had not yet let the reaches fall entirely into disorder, which I took as a reasonable sign of his competence. The treatment house settled into a new rhythm. The mudslide patients began to recover and return, in ones and twos, to their farmsteads. The frantic pace of the first week eased into the ordinary work of a valley treatment house. Minor injuries, winter ailments, the chronic conditions of an aging farming population that walked long distances in cold weather and worked their bodies harder than the cold weather strictly warranted. I became, without quite deciding to, part of the working structure of the place. Fenwick thought this was the best thing that had happened in Grayville Valley possibly ever. He followed me with the devotion of a young wolf who has decided an older wolf is worth studying, and I answered his questions about the reaches, about governance, about the etiquette of various territorial disputes, and the correct way to address a beta's third wife at a formal gathering, with as much honesty as I thought a 12-year-old could use. He had sharp instincts and a good memory, which are more useful than most formal educations, and he was, in addition to being my unofficial guide, apparently also something like Senna's unofficial younger brother, a position he had appointed himself to some years back when she first came to the valley. She was alone when she came, he told me one afternoon, while we were splitting firewood in the side yard. He had appointed himself chief of firewood operations and was currently supervising my technique with the unearned authority of someone who has been doing this since he was 6. After her mother died, she came up the track with 2 bags and asked old healer Davin if he needed help. He paused to correct my grip on the axe. He did. He was very old. She learned everything he knew, and then he died too, and she just kept going. He considered this. She's good at keeping going. I know, I said. He looked at me with the unsettling acuity of children who have been paying attention to adults longer than adults realize. She's better since you came, he said. Not as a compliment, as an observation, as if he were noting a change in weather. She laughs more. I thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. In the evenings after the treatment house quieted, we continued. It was not, I want to be clear, a courtship in any formal sense. There was no ceremony to it, no structure. It was simply 2 people at a table near a hearth in an old building on the edge of a valley, talking in the way that people talk when they have been waiting to talk for a long time and are finally, carefully learning how. She told me about her mother. I told her about my father. She told me about the first years in Grayville Valley, the loneliness of them, and then the slow accrual of the valley's trust, which had taken 2 winters, and the recovery of a particularly difficult case involving a farmer's infected shoulder and a great deal of patience. I told her about the reaches, not its governance, its politics, its territorial complications, but the reaches as a physical thing, the way the land changes as you move east, the particular quality of the light over the upper foothills in late autumn, the way the wolf song carries in cold air differently than in warm. She listened to the wolf song part the way she listened to things that mattered, with her whole attention, without filling the space. I've never run with a pack, she said. My mother was packless. Her mother was too. She said it without apology. It was simply a fact of her history, delivered as she delivered facts. I know what it means in the reaches. No alphas mark, no territory. A woman in the border settlements is more navigable without pack designation, but I know what it means when you cross into full pack territory. It means nothing to me, I said, or it means that you chose your own path, which is not a thing I can offer my own people. They are born to the reaches. You walked to the border and made something. I looked at her. That is not nothing. She looked at me for a long moment. You're different than I expected, she said. When I heard that an Alpha King had been riding the border roads asking after a healer's daughter, she said it thoughtfully, not critically. I thought you might be. Frightening, I offered. The corner of her mouth moved. I was going to say, sure of yourself, in a way that would be difficult. I was that, I said. I've been working on it. She laughed then, fully, warmly, the laugh of someone who did not expect to and found it worth having. It was the first time I had heard her laugh like that, without reserve, without the slight self-editing of someone who was still deciding if this was safe. Something in my chest unlocked at the sound of it in a way that had nothing to do with the wolf and everything to do with something simpler. Something that did not have a name in the treaty language of the reaches. I thought I could learn her laugh. I thought, I already know it. I thought, these are the same thing, and that is the strangest and most correct thing I have understood in 3 years. In the 3rd week, my wolf began to do something I had no previous reference for. He had been still since the first morning in the valley, that sufficiency, that sense of arrival. But in the 3rd week, the stillness changed quality. It deepened in the way that very cold water deepens as winter progresses, not a new thing but a more of the same thing, and so much more that it became different. He was not pulling. He was not restless. He was attending, in the way he attended when something significant was approaching, and I could feel at the very edge of perception that what he was attending to was a warmth centered, specifically, on both of my wrists. It was faint. I had heard enough of the lore to know what it signaled, and I was careful, in those early days of the 3rd week, not to look at my wrists when Senna was present. Not because I was afraid of what I would see. I had stopped being afraid of this particular truth approximately 2.5 years ago, somewhere on a winter road east of the Ashvaran border, but because it was hers as much as mine, and I would not push the pace of something she had a right to name in her own time. I knew she felt it. I saw the moment she noticed. She was preparing a poultice one morning, and she paused. Her hands simply stopped for perhaps 3 seconds over the bowl, and then she looked at her wrist briefly, and then she looked at me. I was not looking at my own wrist. I was looking at her. I did not look away. Neither did she. How long? She said. 3rd week, I said. She looked back at the poultice. She resumed her preparation with the unhurried precision of someone who has processed a significant thing and decided to continue working. All right, she said. Thank you for telling me. That was all for that day. 3 days later, she asked me, in the evening, what the mate mark had meant to my parents. I told her what I remembered, that my father had said it was the deepest knowledge he had ever had. That he had said it was the difference between a life spent managing uncertainty and a life that had, at its center, one thing that was simply known. My mother had said something similar but in different language. She had said it was like finally being able to put something down that you had been carrying so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. Senna listened. She was quiet afterward for a while, in the way she was quiet when she was settling something in herself. I'm not afraid of it, she said. I want you to know that I'm not. It's not fear. She looked at me. It's that I've been my own, she paused, finding the right word, my own authority since my mother died. Every decision has been mine, and I've learned to trust my own judgment, and I'm careful about decisions that can't be undone. As you should be, I said. She looked at me steadily. You'd wait, she said, if I asked you to wait longer. Yes, I said. Without you wouldn't push. No, I held her gaze. Senna, I spent 3 years riding border roads because I failed to speak when I should have. That is not a mistake I intend to repeat in the other direction. A long pause, the fire. I know what it is, she said. I think I've known since you walked into this room, maybe since the ceremony hall. I think I knew it then and left because knowing it and trusting it are not the same thing, and she stopped. I had no evidence about you, only the knowing. And knowing alone didn't feel like enough. And now, I said. She looked at the fire, she looked at her hands, she looked at me. Now I have evidence, she said. The mate mark came on the 5th week, early in the morning before full light. I was awake when it happened. I had been awake for some time, not from anxiety, which was what had kept me awake on roads in the previous 3 years, but from the particular restlessness of a man who is waiting for something he knows is coming and cannot sleep around it. My wrists had been warm for weeks. The warmth had been deepening, in the same way my wolf's stillness had deepened, and in the gray hour before light I felt it change, not sharpen exactly, but clarify, the way a sound clarifies when the background noise drops away and you hear the tone beneath it. Both wrists, simultaneously. I looked. The mark was the Ashvaran pattern, the running wolf, the 3 ridgelines, old moon and new moon overlaid, and it was bright against my skin, and it was entirely without pain. The lore said it should ache. The lore, I noted, was wrong. It felt like the word for something you have known so long that knowing it has become indistinguishable from breathing. I sat with it for a few minutes, in the gray quiet, alone. Then I heard the door at the end of the hall. She was in the treatment house's small back garden when I found her, a narrow strip of cold ground that Senna had turned, over 2 winters, into something productive. It was too early in the season for most of it, but there were things under the cold soil that she tended regardless of season, and she tended them in the early mornings when she needed to think. She was looking at her wrists when I came through the door. She looked up. In the gray light her face was open in a way I had not seen it before, not vulnerable, more like resolved. The face of a woman who has been making her way toward something for a long time and has arrived. I was coming to find you, she said. I know, I said. We stood for a moment in the cold garden, the 2 marks between us in the early light. Her mark was, I should not have been surprised. I had known from the lore that the mate mark was unique to the bond, that it expressed itself differently in each pairing, and yet seeing it was still the feeling of completing a sentence I had not known I was midway through saying. It was not the Ashvaran pattern. It was her own. 3 interlocking lines that suggested a path or a river or a horizon and overlaid on them a small wolf print, simple as a pressed hand. A healer's mark. A traveler's mark. I want to say something first, she said, before we say the rest. Of course, I said. She looked at her wrists, she looked at me. I left without looking back, she said. I want you to know that I knew what I was doing when I did it. I'm not someone who does things without knowing what I'm doing. I left because I read your silence as a door closed, and I am careful enough with my own dignity that I don't beg entry into closed doors. She paused. I'm telling you this not to reproach. I'm telling you because I think you've been carrying for 3 years the idea that I left because you failed some test. And you didn't. You were silent and I misread the silence, and we both had 3 years with the consequences. She held his gaze. I'm not angry, I want you to know that. I'm not whatever I was in the first months. I've had time. Her voice was level, clear, the voice she used when delivering important information to patients. Not cold, not warm, simply true. I wanted to tell you that I understand what the 3 years were. I understand what it costs to ride every road in the reaches. I'm not a breath. I'm not taking it as payment or as proof or as something you owed me. I'm taking it as who you are, and I want you to know I see that. I was quiet for a moment. The cold garden held the sound of her words. When you left, I said finally, I stood at the eastern table in that hall and I looked at the tray you had left behind and I thought, I have just failed the most important thing I have ever been given and I don't know how to undo it. And I couldn't undo not speaking, but I could find you. So I rode. I looked at her. I need you to know that it was not penance. It was not payment. It was simply the only true direction I had. North is north. You were where I was pointed. I paused. I would have ridden another 10 years if you had needed 10 years. Her eyes were bright. I know that, she said quietly. That's evidence. We were standing close enough in the garden that I could have reached for her hand without stepping. I did not reach. She had said, weeks ago, that she would name what she knew in her own time, and I had meant what I said. I would not push. She reached for mine. Her hand was warm, the way her wrists were warm, the mark's warmth, the bond's warmth, the specific warmth of a thing that has been running quietly in the deep of you for so long that its presence has stopped feeling like a presence and started feeling like a fact. She held my hand in both of hers, the way a healer holds something that is being assessed, not clinically but attentively, with her full understanding brought to bear. I chose this, she said, not to me or not only to me, to herself and to the morning and to whatever it is in the bond that requires the naming as much as the feeling. I want you to know that. I'm choosing it knowing what it is and who you are, not because I have to, not because the mark says I must. She looked up. Because I've watched you carry a water barrel and hold a door and answer a 12-year-old's questions about treaty etiquette for 5 weeks, and I think, the corner of her mouth moved. I think you might be worth the trouble. Something in my chest, the thing that had been wound tight for 3 years, the thing that had kept me riding when the roads were bad and the weather worse and the next settlement was a day away and the one after that came undone. Simply, entirely, without ceremony. The way a knot releases when the right pressure is found. I brought her hand to my mouth. I held it there for a moment, just the warmth of her hand, the mark's warmth against my lips. A king's pledge in the oldest form of the reaches. Not a vow spoken to a crowd, not a public ceremony, not a Luna's coronation in a hall full of watching eyes. Just this, just her, just the acknowledgement of what was true. Worth the trouble, I said against her hand. That is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me. She laughed again, that full warm laugh without reservation. The gray morning held it. We told Fenwick first, which was not a formal protocol of the Ashvaran reaches, but which seemed, practically speaking, the correct order of things. He looked at our wrists, he looked at us. He said, with the composure of a 12-year-old who had seen this coming, and is not impressed that adults take so long, "Good." Then he asked whether Senna would still be in Grayville Valley, or whether she would have to go to the reaches, and Senna said they were still working that out, and Fenwick said that whatever they worked out he expected to be consulted, because he had been carrying water barrels for 5 weeks on the assumption that this would result in something worth the work. I told him I thought that was fair. He seemed satisfied. The older healers were less surprised than anyone. Healers, I was learning, are difficult to surprise. They had seen the direction of things from the first week, and had arranged their schedules around it with the quiet efficiency of people who have been managing human situations longer than the humans in question have been alive. I sent word to my head advisor. His reply, when it arrived, contained a longer string of complete sentences than I had ever received from him, which I took as evidence that he had opinions about this development. The final sentence read, "The Reaches thanks the Alpha King for his safe return and will await further details regarding territorial implications at his earliest convenience, understanding that the Alpha King has his own priorities at present." It was the most diplomatically loaded thing he had ever written me, and I appreciated it. We did not resolve everything in a morning. This seems worth saying clearly, because the shape of things from the outside can look like resolution when it is more accurately the beginning of a shape. We were 2 people who had been separately navigating 3 years of a thing that had no form yet, and we were now, cautiously, beginning to give it form. This takes time. It takes negotiation, not of the political kind but of the more difficult personal kind, where the terms are not written down, and the parties must discover as they go what they actually mean. She had built something in this valley. That was not a small thing. It was 2 winters of work, the trust of a community, a treatment house running on her knowledge and her stubbornness and her willingness to stay when staying was the hard choice. She was not prepared to dissolve that simply because the Reaches were north of here, and the Reaches Alpha had just put his mouth to her hand in a cold garden, and I was not prepared to ask her to. The Ashvaran Reaches were a territory, not a tether. The people in them were mine to govern, not hers to be governed by. These were conversations that would take weeks, months, years to work into the correct shape, and we had time, and that in itself was a gift of a particular quality that I had not expected. What I had expected, I think, was that finding her would be the end of something. That the 3 years of writing would culminate in an arrival that was itself the completion. But arrivals are not completions. They are only the beginning of a different kind of work, the work of being in a place rather than riding toward it, which is harder in its own way and more ordinary and vastly more worth it. She understood this instinctively. She was a healer. She knew that the most important part of any recovery is not the crisis point but the long, undramatic middle, the compressed schedules, the infusion checks, the quiet mornings in the garden when nothing is required but attention and patience, and the willingness to be present for what is actually there rather than what you expected. I was learning. On my last morning in Grayville Valley, before I rode back to the Reaches to attend to the things that required attending to, and before we began the longer, slower negotiation of how 2 lives are fitted together, she found me in the treatment house's entrance room, packing the few things I had brought with me. She handed me a small wrapped bundle. Herbs, from the smell of it, the valley herbs she used in her infusions, the ones she had described over 3 weeks of evenings with the specificity of someone who has spent years learning what the land around her offers. For the road, she said, the upland passes get cold before you're back in the low reaches. Put the dried winter moss in your water when the cough starts, and it will start. You've been in a valley treatment house for 5 weeks and you'll carry half our winter ailments home with you. Thank you, I said. She looked at me for a moment, that level, attentive look, the one she used for things that mattered. 3 years is long, she said. Don't make me wait 3 years for the next part. No, I said, not 3 years. She nodded. She had her compressed schedule in her hand already. The morning rounds did not stop for departures, which was simply the nature of treatment houses, and I was beginning to understand of Senna. The work continued. The world required tending. She would still be here when the next thing needed naming. My wolf, as I walked out into the morning, was not restless. He was not pulling. He was oriented, in the way a wolf is oriented when it knows exactly where home is and has enough faith in the direction to move at its own pace. Not urgency. Not the 3-year ache of a wrong bearing corrected over and over on winter roads. Something quieter. I rode north through the upland basin and into the first ridge of the Ashvaran Reaches, and for the first time in 3 years, the direction of home was simple. The valley was south. The Reaches were north. These were not opposed. A man can face north and no south, and that is not a contradiction. It is simply what it means to have something worth facing toward and something worth returning to. The valley track curved out of sight behind the first ridge. I did not look back. I already knew what was there.